Evan Trenlow leaned back against the gnarled trunk of a vast, alien tree and sighed. The forest of Vireon IX hummed with a low, almost sentient vibration. Every leaf seemed alive, brimming with electric energy. He adjusted the clasp on his environmental suit. Though the breathable atmosphere didn't really require one, he just liked to keep his skin free of whatever bizarre microbes might be floating around. The outpost behind him bustled with nervous activity. Crewmates loaded survey data onto shuttles. While others shouted about increasing sightings of the beast, everyone was on edge, though none more than the head of the expedition, Callan Nordren. Trenlow barked Callan, storming up the path, his expression a mixture of frustration and barely contained fear. "Why are you out here? Do you even care about the security briefings?" Evan gave him a lazy smile. "Security briefings? Is that what you call yelling at everyone to stay indoors while some overgrown critter stalks the woods?" "This isn't a joke," Callan hissed, leaning closer. "That thing out there, the Drevlik, do you even understand what it's capable of? It tore through the last expedition's armored transport like paper. 3 people gone, just like that." Evan shrugged. "Sounds like they made it mad. Did anyone think about not doing that?" Callan's face turned red, but before he could launch into another tirade, an alarm blared across the outpost. The siren was piercing, designed to cut through even the dense atmosphere of Vireon IX. A harried voice crackled through the intercom. "Drevlik sighted. Perimeter breached. All personnel return to the main compound immediately." Panic swept through the outpost. Scientists and technicians abandoned their equipment, rushing for safety. Evan, however, remained where he was, tilting his head toward the tree line. "That's the second time this week," he mused aloud. "Are you insane?" Callan grabbed his arm, attempting to haul him back toward the compound. "Move it, Trenlow, unless you've got a death wish." Evan shook him off. "I'll catch up. I want to see it." Callan stared at him aghast. "See it? Are you fine? Get yourself killed, you lunatic." He stormed off, leaving Evan alone. The forest grew still as the alarm faded into the distance. Evan stood in the clearing, hands resting casually on his belt, scanning the trees. He'd heard enough descriptions to know what to look for: a creature the size of a dropship, covered in dark, reflective scales that seemed to ripple like liquid metal. He wasn't disappointed. The Drevlik emerged from the shadows with an eerie grace. Its body was massive, easily twice the height of the tallest tree, yet it moved soundlessly, as if the ground itself bent to accommodate it. Its many eyes glinted like polished obsidian, each one fixed on Evan. Most people would have bolted at the sight of it, but Evan just grinned. "Well, aren't you a beauty?" he said, his voice calm and even. The Drevlik paused, tilting its massive head in a way that almost seemed curious. "Not used to people sticking around," Evan continued, taking a slow step forward. He raised his hands, palms outward, to show he was unarmed. "I get it. Big, scary alien predator. Everyone's terrified of you, but I'm not here to fight." The creature let out a low, rumbling sound that resonated deep in Evan's chest. It wasn't quite a growl, more like the vibration of a massive engine idling. "Yeah, I know that trick," Evan said, still moving closer. "You're trying to scare me off. Not gonna work, though. See, I don't think you're the mindless monster everyone says you are. You're just misunderstood." The Drevlik shifted its weight, the ground trembling beneath its bulk. For a moment, Evan wondered if he'd pushed his luck too far. But then the creature lowered its head, bringing its many-eyed gaze level with his. "There we go," Evan murmured. He reached into a pouch on his belt and pulled out a small, glowing orb. It was a nutrient capsule, designed to sustain human explorers in the field, but he figured the Drevlik might appreciate it. He tossed it lightly toward the creature, which caught it midair with a flick of its enormous tongue. The rumbling sound returned, softer this time, almost like a purr. Evan chuckled. "See? Not so scary after all." The Drevlik watched him for a long moment, then turned and disappeared back into the forest. When Evan returned to the outpost, the compound was in chaos. Callan was shouting orders, demanding updates on the creature's location, while others frantically reviewed security footage. Trenlow Callan spotted him and stormed over, his face a mix of anger and disbelief. "You're alive? How in the void did you what happened out there?" Evan shrugged. "Had a little chat with your Drevlik. Turns out, it's not so bad once you get to know it." Cowan's jaw dropped. "You, talk to it." "More like mutual understanding," Evan said. "It's not a monster, Cowan, it's just curious." The rest of the team stared at him as if he'd grown a second head. Cowan looked ready to argue, but before he could, the same harried voice from earlier crackled over the intercom again. "Drevlik is retreating. No further sightings. Perimeter secure." Evan smirked. "See? Told you it wasn't here to cause trouble." Callan grabbed his arm, his voice low and furious. "This isn't over, Trenlow. You're going to explain exactly what you did out there. And I swear, if you've compromised this mission—" "Relax," Evan said, pulling free. "I'll handle it." As he walked away, he felt the eyes of the entire outpost on him. Some looked skeptical, others awed, but none more curious than the Drevliks had been. For the first time since arriving on Vireon IX, Evan felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. 2 days had passed since Evan's encounter with the Drevlik, and the outpost was still abuzz with speculation. Every conversation seemed to circle back to him. Some of the crew thought he was lying, others believed he'd survived by sheer luck, and a few whispered about some innate talent Evan must have to communicate with the terrifying creature. Evan ignored the chatter. He was too busy preparing for his next expedition into the forest. "Are you really going back out there?" said Kara, a biologist who worked in the specimen lab. She stood at the edge of the supply room, watching as Evan stuffed a satchel with tools, nutrient capsules, and a few other odds and ends. "Yep," Evan replied without looking up. "You're insane," she said, folding her arms. "You do know that thing could have killed you, right? And you're just going to waltz back into its territory." Evan grinned. "It didn't kill me the first time. Besides, I've got a feeling about this." "A feeling," Kara said incredulously. "Evan, the Drevlik isn't a stray dog you can win over with treats." "Not with that attitude," he said, slinging the satchel over his shoulder. "Look, Kara, I get it. Everyone's afraid of this thing because it's big and scary and broke some poor fool's transport. But I'm telling you, it's smarter than we think. I just need to prove it. And if you're wrong." Evan paused, then shrugged. "Then I guess I won't be around to say I told you so." With that, he headed out, leaving Kara shaking her head. The forest was quieter this time. The usual hum of insectoid lifeforms and rustling foliage seemed muted, as if the entire ecosystem was holding its breath. Evan trudged deeper into the woods, stopping occasionally to mark his path with bioluminescent tabs. He didn't have to wait long for the Drevlik to find him. The ground trembled slightly as the massive creature emerged from the shadows, its liquid metal scales catching the faint light filtering through the canopy. It let out a low, resonant sound that Evan now recognized as a greeting rather than a threat. "Hey there, big guy," he said, holding up his hands. "Miss me?" The Drevlik tilted its head, studying him with its many eyes. It lowered itself slightly, its enormous body coiling like a spring, as if to get a better look. "I brought you something," Evan said, pulling a small device from his satchel. It was a scanning tool, modified to emit a sequence of light pulses. He aimed it at the ground and activated it, creating a pattern of glowing shapes that danced across the forest floor. The Drevlik watched intently, its eyes flicking between the lights and Evan. Then, to his astonishment, it extended one of its massive forelimbs and tapped the ground near the lights. The vibrations it produced caused the shapes to shift and ripple. Evan's jaw dropped. "You're interacting with it." The creature rumbled softly, almost as if amused. It tapped the ground again, creating a new pattern of vibrations that Evan realized formed a rudimentary response. "You're playing with it," he said, a grin spreading across his face. "You're not just smart, you're creative." He spent the next several hours experimenting with the Drevlik, using the light pulses and vibrations to communicate. The patterns grew increasingly complex, and Evan got the distinct impression that the creature was enjoying itself. By the time he returned to the outpost, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting the forest in a deep purple glow. Evan was exhausted but exhilarated. He had tangible proof that the Drevlik wasn't a mindless predator. Callan was waiting for him at the gate, his expression dark. "You've got some nerve," he said as Evan approached. "Disobeying orders, putting yourself at risk, endangering this entire mission." "I wasn't endangering anything," Evan interrupted, brushing past him. "In fact, I might have just saved this mission." Callan followed him into the compound, fuming. "What are you talking about?" Evan dropped his satchel on the nearest table and pulled out the scanning tool. "The Drevlik. It's intelligent. I've got data to prove it." The room went silent as crew members gathered around, curious. Evan activated the tool, projecting the patterns he and the Drevlik had created onto a nearby wall. "These aren't random," he explained. "They're responses. It wasn't just reacting to the lights, it was thinking about them, altering them, making them its own. This thing isn't a mindless monster, it's a sentient being." Callan stared at the projections, his skepticism wavering. Sentient or not, it's still dangerous. What's to stop it from turning on us the next time it gets bored? Maybe the fact that it hasn't already, Evan countered. "Look, I get it, you're scared. We all are. But we've got a chance here, Callan. A chance to make contact with a truly alien intelligence. Isn't that why we're here?" Callan didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the glowing patterns. The rest of the crew murmured among themselves, some clearly intrigued, others less convinced. Finally, Kara stepped forward. "If Evan's right, this changes everything. We'd need to rethink our entire approach to the mission. No more perimeter defenses, no more treating the Drevlik like it's a threat. We'd need to study it, communicate with it, learn from it." Callan sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "You're asking me to gamble the safety of this crew on the word of a man who can't follow orders." "I'm asking you to trust me," Evan said. The room fell silent again. After a long pause, Callan nodded reluctantly. "Fine, but if anything goes wrong, Trenlow, it's on you." Evan grinned. "Wouldn't have it any other way." As the crew dispersed, Kara pulled him aside. "You're playing a dangerous game, Evan. What if the Drevlik isn't as friendly as you think?" Evan shrugged. "Then I guess I'll just have to be friendlier." Kara shook her head, but there was a hint of a smile on her face. That night, as Evan lay in his bunk, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd only scratched the surface of the Drevlik's potential. It wasn't just a creature to be studied, it was a mind to be understood. And for the first time, he felt like he was part of something truly extraordinary. Evan's growing rapport with the Drevlik changed the dynamics of the entire expedition. Over the next week, the outpost transformed from a panicked bunker into a hub of cautious curiosity. Gone were the emergency alarms and panic drills. In their place came long-range observation tools and a surprising willingness to venture beyond the perimeter. Evan, of course, continued to take the lead, venturing into the forest daily to meet the Drevlik. Each interaction deepened his understanding of the creature's intelligence. The patterns it created with vibrations grew more intricate, almost artistic, and Evan began to notice that it repeated certain sequences more often than others. "Could be a language," Kara said one morning, examining the recordings Evan had brought back. She squinted at the holographic patterns on her tablet, muttering to herself as if trying to decipher an ancient code. "It's not random, that's for sure. These recurring sequences, they mean something." "I've been saying that for days," Evan replied, leaning back in his chair with a smug grin. Kara rolled her eyes. "You've been guessing, not saying. I'm trying to prove it." The door to the lab slid open, and Callan strode in, his expression grim as usual. "Trenlow, Kara, I hope you're making progress, because we've got a situation." Evan sat up straight. "What kind of situation?" "Another outpost picked up a distress signal," Callan said. "It's on the other side of the forest. They're pinned down by something." "You think it's another Drevlik?" Kara asked. Callan nodded. "It's possible. If it's anything like the one we've seen, they won't last long without help." Evan frowned. "Why are we just hearing about this now? Shouldn't we have been monitoring for distress calls?" Callan shot him a look. We were monitoring for things like the Drevlik breaking through our perimeter, not random emergencies halfway across the planet. So, what's the plan? Evan asked. I'm sending a rescue team, Callan said. But if there is another Drevlik out there, we need to figure out whether it's hostile and fast. That's where you come in. Evan blinked. Me. You're the expert now, aren't you? Callan said dryly. If anyone can figure out how to deal with these things, it's you. Evan hesitated. He'd spent enough time with the Drevlik to know it wasn't a threat, but he couldn't be sure the same applied to others of its kind. Still, he couldn't ignore the possibility that his unique connection might save lives. Fine, he said, standing up. I'll go, but I'm bringing my friend with me. Callan's eyes narrowed. You mean the Drevlik? Who else? Evan replied. The room fell silent. Kara looked at him like he'd lost his mind. Evan, you can't be serious. You want to bring that thing into an active rescue operation. Why not? Evan said. It knows this forest better than any of us, and it's already proven it won't hurt me. If there's a chance it can help us, I'm taking it. Callan threw up his hands. You've officially gone off the deep end, Trenlow. But fine. If you think you can get that thing to cooperate, be my guest. Just don't come crying to me when it eats you. Evan grinned. Deal. The next morning, Evan set out into the forest, his heart pounding with anticipation. He wasn't entirely sure the Drevlik would come with him. It wasn't like he could just leash it and call it a day, but he had to try. When the creature appeared, gliding silently through the trees, Evan greeted it with the now familiar light pulses from his scanning tool. The Drevlik responded with a series of vibrations that Evan had come to interpret as curiosity. Hey buddy, Evan said, stepping closer. I need your help. There's a group of people in trouble on the other side of the forest. Something's hunting them. Maybe it's another one of your kind, maybe it's something else, but we need to find out. The Drevlik tilted its head, its eyes gleaming like polished onyx. I'm not asking you to fight, Evan continued. I just need you to guide me there. Show me the safest way through. Can you do that? The creature let out a low, resonant sound that Evan recognized as agreement. Thanks, big guy, he said, smiling. I knew I could count on you. The journey to the distress signal took the better part of a day. The Drevlik moved with astonishing speed and agility, weaving through the dense forest like a shadow. Evan struggled to keep up, but he trusted the creature's instincts. As they neared the other outpost, the air grew heavy with tension. The usual hum of the forest was gone, replaced by an eerie silence. Even the Drevlik seemed wary, its movements slower and more deliberate. They found the survivors huddled in the wreckage of a transport, their faces pale with fear. When they saw Evan approach, accompanied by the Drevlik, their fear turned to panic. Stay back, one of them shouted, raising a makeshift weapon. Relax, Evan called, holding up his hands. It's with me. With you, another survivor sputtered. Are you insane? That thing isn't here to hurt you, Evan interrupted. Trust me, if it wanted you dead, you'd already be dead. Now tell me what happened. The survivors hesitated, then one of them stepped forward. We were transporting survey data when something hit us. Big, fast, knocked us right out of the sky. We managed to land, but it's out there, watching us. Evan nodded, glancing at the Drevlik. It stood motionless, its many eyes scanning the surrounding trees. Any idea what it is? Evan asked. The survivor shook his head. It wasn't like that thing, he said, pointing at the Drevlik. It was smaller, sleeker, like a hunter. Evan frowned. A smaller predator wasn't what he'd expected. If anything, it complicated matters. But before he could dwell on it, the Drevlik let out a low growl, its body tensing. Evan turned just in time to see a shadow dart between the trees. Everyone, get inside the wreckage, he shouted. The survivors scrambled to comply, while the Drevlik positioned itself between them and the forest. Evan crouched beside it, gripping his scanning tool like a weapon. The shadow appeared again, this time closer. It moved like liquid, its sleek, serpentine body barely making a sound as it weaved through the underbrush. Evan's heart raced, but he forced himself to stay calm. Easy, he murmured, both to himself and the Drevlik. Let's not do anything stupid. The creature stepped into the open, its emerald green scales glinting in the dim light. It was smaller than the Drevlik, but no less intimidating, with long, razor-sharp limbs and a predatory gaze. For a moment, the two creatures stared at each other, their bodies tense with unspoken challenge. Then, to Evan's astonishment, the Drevlik let out a low, rhythmic vibration. The smaller creature froze, its head tilting slightly. Then, slowly, it responded with a series of sharp clicks. "There," talking Evan whispered, barely able to believe it. The Drevlik turned to look at him, its gaze calm and reassuring. Evan realized with a start that it wasn't just protecting him, it was negotiating. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours, before the smaller creature let out one final click and vanished into the forest. Evan let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "What just happened?" one of the survivors asked, peeking out from the wreckage. Evan smiled. "We made a friend." The survivor's transport was little more than a crumpled husk, its hull warped and peppered with claw marks from the smaller predator. With the immediate danger gone, the survivors began to emerge, their movements hesitant as they kept a wide berth from the Drevlik. Evan leaned against a jagged piece of the wreck, watching as his alien companion inspected the damage. Its massive claws moved with surprising delicacy, almost as if it were curious about the human craft. "So what now?" asked Roran, the leader of the stranded group. He was a grizzled man with a no-nonsense demeanor, though his eyes betrayed the fear he was trying to mask. "We hike," Evan said simply, tossing a nutrient capsule to Roran. "Your distress signal's been picked up. Our outpost is a day's walk from here, maybe less if we cut through the canyons. You stick with me," and he gestured to the Drevlik. "My friend here, and you'll be fine." Roran stared at the massive creature warily. "You trust that thing?" Evan smirked. "More than I trust some of the people back at the outpost." The other survivors exchanged uneasy glances, but they didn't argue. With their transport wrecked and their communication systems freed, Evan was their best shot at getting out alive. The journey back was grueling. The forest grew denser as they traveled, the air thick with humidity and the scent of alien flora. The Drevlik moved ahead of the group, its massive form carving a path through the underbrush. Despite its size, it moved with remarkable stealth, its footsteps barely making a sound. As they walked, Evan noticed how the survivors' attitudes began to shift. At first, they kept their distance, whispering nervously whenever the Drevlik came near. But as the hours passed and the creature continued to guide them without so much as a threatening growl, their fear began to fade. "It's almost." Gentle, muttered Nara, a young technician who had been tending to a sprained ankle. She watched as the Drevlik paused to nudge a fallen tree out of the way with its massive snout. "That's what I've been trying to tell everyone," Evan said. "It's still terrifying," Roran grumbled, though his tone lacked the edge it had earlier. "Yeah, well, maybe terrifying isn't the same thing as evil," Evan replied. The group pressed on, eventually reaching the edge of the forest, just as the twin suns of Vireon IX dipped below the horizon. The landscape opened into a vast canyon system, its jagged cliffs bathed in the eerie light of the planet's bioluminescent plants. "This is the shortcut?" Roran asked, eyeing the narrow, winding path that snaked along the canyon walls. "Unless you want to go the long way around," Evan said, already heading down the trail. The survivors followed reluctantly, their movements careful on the uneven terrain. The Drevlik, however, seemed completely at ease. It moved along the cliffside with the confidence of a creature born to this environment, its glowing eyes scanning the shadows for any signs of danger. Halfway through the canyon, the group encountered trouble. A deep, guttural roar echoed through the air, followed by the unmistakable sound of claws scraping against rock. Evan spun around just in time to see a pack of smaller predators, sleek, four-legged creatures with mottled hides and elongated jaws, emerge from a nearby crevice. "Stay together," he shouted, motioning for the group to back against the canyon wall. The predators circled, their movements coordinated and predatory. Evan counted at least 5, their eyes glowing with an unsettling intelligence. The Drevlik moved to the front of the group, its massive body a shield between the humans and the approaching pack. It let out a low, resonant growl that seemed to vibrate the very air around them. The lead predator hesitated, its claws digging into the rock as it assessed the situation. For a moment, Evan thought the Drevlik's warning might be enough to scare them off. But then the pack attacked. The canyon erupted into chaos. The predators moved as one, darting in with incredible speed, their jaws snapping at the Drevlik's flanks. The massive creature responded with a ferocity Evan had never seen before. It swiped at the attackers with its massive claws, each strike sending shockwaves through the ground. "Get down," Evan shouted, pulling Roran and Nera behind a boulder as the fight raged on. The Drevlik was a force of nature, its movements both brutal and precise. It managed to fend off most of the predators, but one broke through its defenses and lunged toward the humans. Evan didn't hesitate. He grabbed a nearby rock and hurled it with all his strength, striking the creature square in the jaw. It snarled, rearing back in surprise, and Evan used the opportunity to shove it away with a makeshift staff he'd fashioned earlier. The Drevlik roared, a sound so loud and powerful that it seemed to shake the canyon itself. The remaining predators scattered, retreating into the shadows as the echo of the roar faded. For a moment, all was still. "You okay?" Evan asked, turning to check on the group. "We're alive," Roran said, his voice shaky. He glanced at the Drevlik, which stood motionless, its many eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of lingering threats. "Thanks to that thing." "It's not a thing," Evan said firmly. "It's a friend." The Drevlik turned to look at him, its gaze calm and steady despite the deep gashes along its side. Evan stepped forward cautiously, placing a hand on its massive flank. "Thanks, big guy," he said softly. "You saved us." The creature rumbled in response, a sound that Evan was beginning to recognize as its version of gratitude. By the time they reached the outpost, word of the rescue had already spread. The gates opened to a crowd of stunned faces, their expressions a mixture of awe and disbelief as the Drevlik followed Evan and the survivors inside. Callan was waiting for them, his mouth hanging open as he took in the sight. "You actually did it," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Did you ever doubt me?" Evan replied with a grin. The survivors were quickly ushered inside for medical treatment, but Evan stayed behind with the Drevlik. The massive creature stood in the middle of the compound, its many eyes observing the humans with what could only be described as quiet curiosity. "So what now?" Callan asked, stepping up beside Evan. "Now," Evan said, "we stop treating it like a threat and start treating it like a partner." Callan sighed, shaking his head. "You're a stubborn man, Trenlow, but I'll admit, you might be onto something." The Drevlik let out a soft rumble, its eyes glinting in the fading light. Evan smiled. "Might be." Over the following weeks, the Drevlik became an unlikely ally to the outpost. It helped clear dangerous paths, protected the crew from other predators, and even began to interact with some of the braver scientists. Its once feared presence was now a source of fascination and hope. And as Evan watched his alien friend settle into its new role, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of satisfaction. Sometimes, he thought, the monsters we fear are just waiting for someone to see them differently.